The quiet lapping of water against the hull was a sound woven into the fabric of my weekends, a gentle percussion to the symphony of breeze and bird song. It was the sound of my boat, the Amelia's Lark, named for my mother, tethered securely to my private dock on the shores of my private lake. Or so I believed. This Saturday, the silence was different. It wasn't peace. It was an absence, a void where the comforting silhouette of the lark should have been. I stood on the weathered planks, the morning sun warming my face, a sickening lurch in my stomach that had nothing to do with the coffee I hadn't yet finished. Gone. The mooring lines, neatly coiled as I'd left them, lay on the dock like discarded snakeskins. There were faint impressions in the soft earth near the access path, wider than my usual truck tires. A cold dread, sharp and unwelcome, pierced the tranquility. My initial scan of the shoreline revealed nothing but the familiar reeds and ancient willows that guarded my property. No Amelia's Lark. Not bobbing gently, not adrift, simply erased. The initial frantic search gave way to a chilling stillness as the implications began to coalesce. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. Back at the house, amidst the scattered property maps and half-read case files that usually adorned my study, lay the day's mail. A single cream-colored envelope stood out, embossed with an unfamiliar, rather pretentious crest. Lakeview Estates Homeowners Association. I didn't belong to any HOA. My land, encompassing the entire 300-acre Clearwater Lake and a significant parcel of the surrounding woodlands and the small boat park at its northern edge, predated any such modern contrivance by decades. My ownership was absolute, documented in chains of title stretching back to the original land grants. The letter inside was brief, chillingly smug. It informed the resident that my boat, identified by its registration number, how courteous, had been deemed excessively dirty and in violation of community aesthetic guidelines. Therefore, it had been removed by authorized community agents and transported to a designated boat reclamation facility, a rather poetic term for a dump, I suspected. The real poetry, however, was in the final paragraph. A fine. An $800 fine, levied for these egregious violations and the cost of its remediation. $800,000. The paper felt slick in my suddenly cold hand. The signature at the bottom belonged to a Brenda Millstone, President, Lakeview Estates HOA. I vaguely recalled the name, a woman with overprocessed hair and an air of perpetual grievance, encountered once or twice when she'd imperiously demanded why non-residents like my family were using the boat launch, my boat launch, built and maintained with my capital. She'd also insinuated that the fees I charged for day-use boat slips in the public park section I owned were exploitative, despite being half the rate of any other facility within 50 miles. My mind, trained to dissect legal arguments and parse statutory language, struggled for a moment with the sheer, unmitigated gall. Community guidelines? My property wasn't in her community. Her community, if it could be called that, was a recent development of 20-odd McMansions, clinging precariously to a sliver of land that abutted my northern forest line. A development I had noted with mild disinterest when it was built, marveling only at their choice of faux Tuscan architecture in a region known for its rustic charm. The fine was not merely punitive, it was hallucinatory, an act of such audacious extortion it bordered on performance art. They didn't know. They couldn't possibly grasp the scale of their misjudgment. The carefully cultivated calm I maintained in courtrooms and negotiations began to fracture, revealing something colder, harder beneath. An $800 fine for my boat. Stolen from my land. By an entity that, as far as I was concerned, possessed the legal standing of a particularly officious garden gnome. This wasn't a bureaucratic blunder. This was a targeted assault. My calls to the listed HOA number were predictably futile, shunted to a saccharine voicemail promising a return call within 3 to 5 business days. An email, concise and demanding immediate clarification, received an automated reply attributing delays to high inquiry volume. Finally, a curt, 2-line response from a Perkins, administrative assistant to President Millstone, materialized hours later. President Millstone is unavailable. The notice is self-explanatory. The fine is non-negotiable, and payment is expected within 30 days to avoid further penalties. Further penalties. The effrontery was almost admirable in its purity. It was the casual arrogance of a petty dictator, accustomed to unquestioning obedience within her tiny sphere of influence. She had mistaken me for one of her serfs. This oversight, I decided with a calm that felt like the still center of a gathering storm, would be her undoing. This was not merely about a boat, nor the outrageous sum demanded. This was about an inviolable principle, the sanctity of property, the rule of law. Brenda Millstone had just kicked open a door she would soon wish had remained bolted, barred, and buried under several tons of concrete. She had declared war. She just didn't realize her adversary owned the entire battlefield, the armory, and the rulebook. My father had taught me to fish from that boat, his laughter echoing over this very lake. My children had learned to steer its gentle curve under his watchful eye before he passed. It wasn't fiberglass and an outboard motor. It was a vessel of memory, a tangible link to a cherished past. And they had treated it like trash, assigning its desecration a value of nearly $1 million. A slow smile touched my lips, devoid of warmth. Oh, Brenda, you have no idea what you've done. The anger was a cold, clarifying fire. There was no room for emotional indulgence, only for meticulous, unassailable strategy. The study, usually a haven of contemplative legal scholarship, transformed into a war room. Property deeds, bound in aging leatherette, were unfurled alongside high-resolution satellite surveys downloaded from the county GIS portal. My fingers traced the boundaries, the red lines demarcating my domain stark against the topographical greens and blues. Clearwater Lake, mine. The surrounding forests, sprawling for hundreds of acres, mine. The access roads, every culvert and gate, mine. And yes, the small, slightly ramshackle boat park, which I had plans to upgrade significantly the following year, also mine. Lakeview Estates, as I suspected, was a cancerous polyp on the edge of my holdings. Their plotted lots stopped short of the actual lakeshore, their supposed lake access appearing to be a tenuous claim over an old logging trail that was unequivocally on my land. Brenda Millstone. I murmured her name, a grit on my tongue. Delusions of sovereignty. My first call was to Marcus Mac Reynolds. Mac was less an investigator and more a digital archaeologist, a man who could unearth skeletons in closets so deep the previous occupants had forgotten they even owned the house. His background in military intelligence gave him a certain methodical ruthlessness, while his sideline passion for exposing petty corruption made him unnervingly enthusiastic about tasks like this. Mac, I said, dispensing with pleasantries, I have a situation. Lakeview Estates HOA. President Brenda Millstone. I need everything. Financials, incorporation papers, bylaws, meeting minutes, board member resumes, any litigation, liens, whispers, rumors. I want to know her preferred brand of toothpaste and whether she flosses after every meal. I want to know if their charter legally allows them to exist outside a Ouija board session. Mac's chuckle was dry, like sandpaper. A live one, huh? Petty tyrants overstepping their Lilliputian boundaries? My favorite. Consider Brenda Millstone and her cabal already under the digital microscope. They play HOA, I play Know Your Enemy. Small pond, you say? We'll see how they like a great white in their goldfish bowl. While Mac began his dive into the murky depths of HOA politics, I commenced my own preparations. This wasn't just a civil matter of a stolen boat anymore. It was rapidly escalating into something requiring a more comprehensive and potentially more punitive response. Torts class, first year of law school, conversion, the wrongful exercise of dominion over the personal property of another. Trespass to chattel, the interference with another's rightful possession of said property. Trespass to land, the unauthorized entry onto, well, my land. And then there was the fine 800, which screamed of something far more sinister than simple overreach. Civil conspiracy? Potentially. Extortion under color of official right, even if that right was wholly fabricated? Closer. The early drafts of cease and desist letters flowed from my keyboard, precise, cold, and laden, with statutory references that would give any competent legal counsel pause. These were not for immediate deployment. They were ranging shots, testing the wind before the barrage. The legal research expanded, spiraling outwards from property law into corporate malfeasance, consumer protection statutes, and even, a faint but intriguing possibility, elements of RICO, if Mac uncovered a pattern of systematic abuse of their claimed authority for financial gain. My family found me hours later, surrounded by illuminated screens, printouts, and a cooling mug of coffee. My daughter, perceptive as ever, asked, "Fixing a big problem, Dad, Mom?" I managed to smile. "Just teaching some people about boundaries, sweetheart. And consequences." The emotional anchor of their presence, their innocent trust in my ability to make things right, only hardened my resolve. This was for them too, for the peace and security of the life we had built here, away from the very sort of officious interference Brenda Millstone represented. Mac's first report arrived via encrypted email late that evening. Subject: The Empress of Lakeview. Attached was a preliminary dossier that made for grimly fascinating reading. Lakeview Estates HOA was, as suspected, a fragile construct. Its financials were a mess of questionable expenditures and anemic reserves. Brenda Millstone, it turned out, had been HOA president for an unprecedented 10 years, consolidating power through a combination of procedural maneuvering and sheer force of personality. Several, smaller, yet equally outrageous, fines had been levied against actual residents of Lakeview Estates over the past few years. Fines for unapproved paint colors, non-compliant lawn ornamentation, even excessively noisy children's play. Most had paid up, cowed into submission or simply unwilling to engage in protracted conflict with the neighborhood autocrat. Her methods were well honed. Mac had also identified the tow company, Bottom Feeders Towing Recovery, a name that practically screamed integrity. Preliminary checks suggested they were indeed barely licensed, operated with a string of customer complaints, and, most tellingly, the registered owner was one Earl Perkins, Brenda Millstone's second cousin's husband. Cozy indeed, I murmured, tracing the crimson outline of my property on the largest survey map, spread across the antique mahogany desk that had once belonged to my grandfather, a judge known for his incisive mind and intolerance for fools. The map was not merely a representation of land. It was a diagram of my rights, and every inch of that crimson line felt personally violated. The absurdity of it all, the demand for a king's ransom, the theft of a beloved boat, all under the flimsy pretext of dirt, coalesced into a single sharp point of focus. They had assumed I was an easy mark. They had mistaken forbearance for weakness. The stage was being set, not for a negotiation, but for a dismantling. The intelligence Mac provided on Bottom Feeders Towing Recovery was the critical next piece. Earl Perkins, proprietor. Address, business registration, even a grainy photo of Earl looking like he wrestled dissatisfied customers for a living. Perfect. I dialed the number listed for Bottom Feeders, my voice deliberately calm, betraying none of the glacial fury coursing beneath the surface. I wasn't a federal lawyer on this call. Not yet. I was simply Mr. Ms. Mann, Clark, owner of a sailboat recently removed from Clearwater Lake. A gravelly voice answered, "Bottom Feeders, Earl speakin'." I explained the situation, feigning mild confusion. "Yes, ma'am, sir. We got the vessel." On account of the HOA. Real specific they were. Eyesore, President Millstone called it. His casual confirmation of Brenda's direct involvement was duly noted. "I see," I said. "And what would be required to retrieve my property?" There was a wet, smacking sound, perhaps Earl enjoying a mid-morning snack. "Well now, there's our tow fee. That's $500. Storage, that's $100 a day, and you're on day 2, so $200 there. Then, let's see, a rustling of papers. Ah, here it is. You got the HOA release fee. President Millstone says that's $800,000. Payable to them, of course. But we can't release the boat till we see proof of payment to the HOA, or get direct say-so from Ms. Millstone herself." He sounded almost proud of the ludicrous figure, as if its sheer magnitude lent him a borrowed importance. I insured my recording device, A discreet pen in my pocket that was a relic from a particularly sensitive undercover case captured every word, his complicity now enshrined in digital amber. One-party consent in this state made it perfectly admissible. 800,000, I repeated, letting a touch of bewildered innocence color my tone. That seems rather substantial for a dirty boat, Earl chuckled, a phlegmy sound. Above my pay grade, friend. I just haul 'em where they tell me. You want your boat, you talk to the Queen Bee of Lakeview. Or pay up. With that confirmation of their active collusion in the extortion, the circle was closing. My next step was the deployment of the demand letters. Not just one, but several, tailored precisely. One for Brenda Millstone, personally and as president of Lakeview Estates HOA. One for each listed board member of the HOA. If Brenda was going down, she wouldn't be going alone. Shared liability was a powerful solvent for unified fronts. And one for Earl Perkins, owner of Bottom Feeders Towing Recovery. Each package was sent via certified mail, return receipt requested, and, for good measure, duplicated and hand-delivered by a stony-faced process server I kept on retainer for particularly recalcitrant targets. The letters were masterpieces of restrained menace. They clearly delineated my ownership of the entire lake, the specific parcel from which the Amelia's Lark was taken, and the access roads utilized by bottom feeders. They detailed the illegality of the HOA's actions: conversion, trespass to chattel, trespass to land. They demanded the immediate, unharmed return of the boat to its original mooring within 24 hours. They demanded the immediate and unequivocal revocation of the fraudulent 800,000 fine. They contained no threats, only stark statements of legal fact and the unavoidable consequences of noncompliance, including but not limited to the pursuit of all available legal remedies, including substantial compensatory and punitive damages. Crucially, my name appeared on the letters without the Esquire suffix. Let them stew in their arrogance a little longer. Let them believe they were dealing with just another irate citizen they could stonewall. Attached to each letter was a copy of the relevant county plat map, my extensive landholdings meticulously outlined in a vibrant, almost offensively cheerful shade of yellow highlighter. I'd also included copies of the core pages from my deed, the legalese, perhaps indecipherable to them, but the official seals and recording stamps hopefully conveying a sense of gravity they had thus far failed to appreciate. The 24-hour deadline was not arbitrary. It was designed to give them just enough rope. My wife found me staring out at the empty dock that evening, the setting sun painting the water in hues of orange and purple. "Are you okay?" she asked, her hand gentle on my arm. "They took something precious," I said, my voice low. "Not just the boat, they took our peace. They presume to exert power where they have none. It's an infection, this kind of petty tyranny. If left unchecked, it spreads." She nodded, understanding far more than I often gave her credit for. "So, you're performing surgery?" "Something like that," I admitted. Radical excision. The deadline expired at noon the following day. The only response was an email from the ever-efficient Ms. Perkins, received at 11:58 a.m. "President Millstone has received your correspondence. The position of the Lakeview Estates HOA remains unchanged. The fine is valid, and payment arrangements must be made. Continued noncompliance will result in further action. Arrogance, stupidity, and a profound lack of imagination." They had willingly, eagerly stepped into the meticulously prepared legal snare. Their dismissive email was the final click of the trap. It wasn't just negligence now. It was willful, defiant continuation of their illegal acts after being fully apprised of the facts. This was the kind of clean, unambiguous evidence litigators dreamed of. I allowed myself a thin, mirthless smile. "Further action," I murmured. Indeed. The transition from aggrieved citizen to legal combatant was seamless. The suit was filed electronically before the county courthouse closed that same afternoon. A weighty digital package containing meticulously drafted pleadings, exhibits, and affidavits. The case caption alone was a declaration. Clark v. Millstone, et al., encompassing every listed board member of the Lakeview Estates HOA and Earl Perkins, D.B., a bottom feeders towing, recovery, jointly and severally. The counts were numerous and unsparing: conversion of chattel for the theft of the Amelia's lark, trespass to chattel for the interference, trespass to land for the unauthorized entry onto my property by the tow truck and, by extension, the HOA's agents, unjust enrichment for their attempt to profit from their illegal acts, intentional infliction of emotional distress, the loss of a vessel with such profound sentimental value, coupled with the outrageous demand, met the threshold. Civil conspiracy for the clear collusion between the HOA and bottom feeders. And, crucially, a demand for a declaratory judgment affirming my undisputed ownership of the lands and lake in question and the HOA's utter lack of jurisdiction, alongside a request for an immediate emergency temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction mandating the boat's return. Compensatory damages were itemized: the daily loss of use of the boat, the cost of any inspections for damage upon its, hopefully, eventual return, and my legal costs, which, even representing myself pro se, I would argue were calculable based on my standard professional rates. Punitive damages were requested in an amount sufficient to deter such conduct by these defendants, and others similarly situated, in perpetuity. The amount? I left it open. To be determined by the trier of fact, but not less than 10 times the fraudulent fine attempted to be extorted. That would get their attention. Process servers, the grim reapers of the litigation world, were dispatched with alacrity. I imagined Brenda Millstone's face, perhaps mid-sip of whatever over-oaked Chardonnay she favored, when the summons and complaint landed in her lap. The Esquire. After my name would be the first tremor. The initial hint that she had profoundly misjudged her opponent. I did not merely own the land. I wielded the law as a precision instrument. Simultaneously, leveraging my federal credentials and professional network, I drafted formal complaints. One to the state bar regarding the HOA's legal counsel, assuming they even had one who had blessed this idiocy. If not, their lack of counsel was in itself a point. Another to the State Attorney General's Office for Consumer Protection, detailing the HOA's pattern of levying exorbitant and baseless fines, bordering on extortion. A concise summary went to the Better Business Bureau. Not that I expected much from them, but it added to the paper trail. Mac, meanwhile, had been a veritable demon of digital discovery. Brenda, he reported with grim satisfaction, has been very naughty with the HOA's plastic. Seems community improvement covers a lot of new shoes and dinners at the Rusty Pelican. And get this, the 800 figure wasn't plucked from thin air entirely. There's a line item in their projected special assessments for shoreline stabilization and beautification initiative for exactly that amount. They were going to fine you, steal your boat, and then try to use the narrative of your blighted property to justify shaking down their own residents to pay for improvements on land that isn't even theirs. It's beautifully circular in its depravity. This revelation added another layer of calculated malice to their actions. My dirty boat was merely the pretext, the convenient scapegoat to kickstart a much larger and much more fraudulent financial maneuver. She tried to make me the villain in her little drama. I mused, reviewing Mac's notes, which included scanned receipts and bank statements he'd acquired. She's about to find out what a real antagonist looks like. The initial call from the HOA's lawyer, a flustered local attorney named Barry Fishbein, whose practice seemed to consist mainly of wills and minor traffic offenses, came the next morning. He sounded like he'd swallowed a hornet's nest. Mr. Clark, Esquire, look, there must be some misunderstanding about this boat situation. His voice was high-pitched, panicked. Mr. Fishbein, I replied, my tone glacial. There is no misunderstanding. My complaint is quite clear. All further communication from your clients or yourself will be in writing and filed with the court. Is that understood? A strangled yelp came down the line. But 800? Punitive damages? Personal liability for the board members? Mrs. Millstone simply believed. What Mrs. Millstone believed, I interrupted, cutting through his stammering, is irrelevant in the face of established property law and tortious conduct. I suggest you advise your clients to secure the immediate return of my boat as a first, very small step towards mitigating the substantial damages they now face. The clock for the emergency hearing is already ticking. I ended the call. The era of polite inquiry was over. The era of systematic legal evisceration had begun. The papers served on Brenda would also include a notice of lis pendens regarding her own property if she lived in Lakeview Estates, a subtle reminder that personal assets were now potentially on the line. The Kraken had not only been unleashed, it was already feasting. The courtroom for the emergency injunction hearing was predictably small, the kind reserved for traffic disputes and minor civil matters, not the forum Brenda Millstone likely envisioned for her imperial pronouncements. She sat beside Barry Fishbein, her face a mask of pinched indignation, her expensive but ill-fitting suit practically crackling with outrage. Fishbein looked like he hadn't slept, his tie askew, a sheen of nervous perspiration on his upper lip. I stood at the plaintiff's table, representing myself. Not as a wounded boat owner, but as an officer of the court, armed with unshakable facts and a righteous fury honed to a razor's edge. The judge, a formidable woman named Henderson with a reputation for surgically dissecting nonsense, regarded the assembled parties over her spectacles. "Mr. Clark," she began, her voice resonant with authority, "you filed for a TRO and preliminary injunction for the return of a boat. This court's emergency docket is typically reserved for matters of imminent threat or irreparable harm. Convince me." I laid out the case with cold precision, no emotion, just facts. Exhibit A, the deed to my property, Clearwater Lake and the surrounding acreage, clearly marked. Exhibit B, satellite imagery and county plat maps showing the exact location of my private dock, well within my property lines and miles from any conceivable boundary of Lakeview Estates. Exhibit C, the HOA's letter, the 800-0 fine, the absurd justification. Exhibit D, Mac's preliminary report on bottom feeders towing and its familial link to President Millstone. Exhibit E, the transcript of my recorded call with Earl Perkins, confirming his agency on behalf of the HOA and their demand for the release fee. Your Honor, I began, my voice measured, this is not merely about a boat, though the vessel itself holds considerable sentimental and monetary value. It is about a brazen act of theft, trespass, and attempted extortion by an entity, the Lakeview Estates HOA, and its president, Ms. Millstone, who possess absolutely no legal authority or jurisdiction over my property or person. I detail the events, the lack of notice, the exorbitant demand. They did not merely tow a boat, Your Honor. They stole it from private property under a demonstrably false pretext and are now attempting to hold it ransom for a sum that defies comprehension. Brenda Millstone shifted in her seat, whispering furiously to Fishbein, who looked increasingly green. Judge Henderson held up a hand. "Mr. Fishbein, your client's response?" Fishbein rose, papers trembling in his hand. "Your Honor, my client, President Millstone, and the Lakeview Estates HOA were acting in good faith, upholding community standards. The vessel in question was an eyesore, algae-covered, frankly lowering the aesthetic appeal of the Lakeview area, which impacts all property values, including those who enjoy views of the lake." Judge Henderson cut him off, her gaze like chips of ice. "Counselor, aesthetic appeal is not a recognized legal basis for larceny. Is your client disputing Mr. Clark's ownership of the land from which this boat was taken? Do they claim title to the Clearwater Lake mooring where this incident occurred?" Fishbein swallowed hard. "Well, Your Honor, the precise boundaries can sometimes be subject to interpretation." "They are not subject to interpretation, Counselor," I interjected smoothly, holding up the certified survey. "They are subject to metes and bounds, clearly recorded with this county for over 70 years. Perhaps Mr. Fishbein would care to produce his client's deed demonstrating any such interpretive rights over my property." Brenda, unable to contain herself, blurted out, "He's not even a member. He flaunts his disrepair. That boat has been a disgrace for months. We have rules." Judge Henderson's gavel came down with a sharp crack. "Miss Millstone, you will be silent or you will be removed. Mr. Fishbein, control your client. Your argument, if I can dignify it with that term, appears to be that your client trespassed, committed conversion, and attempted extortion because they didn't like the look of Mr. Clark's boat on Mr. Clark's land. Is that the sum of it?" Fishbein deflated. "When you put it that way, Your Honor, "There is no other way to put it, counselor," the judge said, her voice dangerously soft. "The injunction is granted. The boat, Amelia's Lark, is to be returned to Mr. Clark's dock, unharmed, within 12 hours of this order, at the sole expense of the defendants, Lakeview Estates, HOA, and Bottom Feeders Towing. Defendants will post a cash bond of $25,000 with this court by close of business today to cover any potential damages sustained by the vessel during its unauthorized removal and storage. A preliminary hearing on the broader issues and damages will be scheduled forthwith. I further order a temporary freeze on 50% of all known HOA accounts to secure potential further judgments." Next case. The gavel fell again, a sound like a coffin nail for Brenda Millstone's reign. She stared, slack-jawed, a grotesque parody of surprise. Barry Fishbein looked like he was about to faint. "Step 1, I thought, gathering my papers, my face impassive. "The Citadel's walls have been breached. Now, to sack the castle." The Amelia's Lark was returned just under the 12-hour deadline, towed sheepishly back by a subdued Earl Perkins himself, under the watchful eye of a sheriff's deputy I'd requested to oversee the transfer. It bore several new, deep scratches along the starboard hull and a suspicious oil stain on the teak decking. I documented everything meticulously: photos, videos, a written inventory of every new imperfection. Each scratch was another nail in their financial coffin. Later that evening, my phone rang. A hesitant voice. "Mr. Clark? This is Arthur Jenkins from down the road in Lakeview Estates. My wife and I, well, we heard what happened in court. We wanted to say thank you. Brenda Millstone has been a tyrant for years. The dam had broken." More calls followed, a trickle, then a flood of disgruntled Lakeview Estates homeowners, finally emboldened to speak out against Brenda's reign of terror, offering affidavits, documentation of their own struggles with her arbitrary fines and dictatorial rule. The silent majority was no longer silent. They were becoming rebellion fodder, eager to supply ammunition for my widening campaign. The court's injunction was merely the opening salvo. Now came the relentless grind of discovery, a process designed to strip away falsehoods and lay bare the unvarnished truth. My requests for production of documents landed on Barry Fishbein's desk with the subtlety of a battering ram. I demanded every scrap of paper, every digital file, all HOA financial records for the past 10 years, including bank statements, ledgers, receipts, and canceled checks, all meeting minutes, both board and general membership, all correspondence, internal and external, related to fines, covenant enforcement, and property disputes, copies of all insurance policies, and the complete, unredacted employment and contract files for any vendors, especially Bottom Feeders Towing. Interrogatories followed, hundreds of sharply pointed questions designed to elicit sworn testimony on their decision-making processes, their understanding, or lack thereof, of their legal boundaries, and the basis for the $800 fine. Each question was a surgical probe, seeking weakness, exposing inconsistency. Mac, my digital ferret, continued his own excavations. "You won't believe this," he cackled during one update call. Brenda's Shoreline Beautification Initiative, the primary contractor listed for the preliminary survey work, for which a $50,000 retainer was already paid from HOA funds last month, is Millstone Landscaping and Design, registered to, wait for it, Brenda's unemployed nephew, Cecil Millstone, whose prior landscaping experience appears to be mowing his own lawn, badly, embezzlement, self-dealing, fraud. The stench of corruption emanating from Lakeview Estates HOA was becoming overpowering. The $800 fine levied against me wasn't just petty revenge or an overzealous application of non-existent rules. It was a desperate, audacious cash grab, likely intended to paper over years of such diversions and to fund new avenues for graft. The documents, grudgingly produced by the HOA, heavily redacted and clearly incomplete despite court orders, told their own damning story. Gaps in financial records, meeting minutes that seemed suspiciously vague on crucial decisions, emails between board members that hinted at panic and attempts to get their stories straight, Brenda Millstone's facade of imperious control was visibly crumbling. Reports from my contacts within the local legal community suggested Fishbein was overwhelmed and out of his depth, trying to manage a client who was simultaneously imploding and refusing to acknowledge reality. The other board members, initially defiant, began to show cracks. One, a nervous accountant named Henderson, no relation to the judge, thankfully, requested a private meeting through his newly retained and far more competent independent counsel. He offered a full confession of Brenda's domineering tactics, her manipulation of votes, her use of HOA funds as a personal slush fund, all in exchange for a potential cooperation agreement. The ship wasn't just sinking. The rats were actively gnawing through the hull to make their escape. My focus, however, was broader than just Brenda's financial malfeasance. I was digging into the very foundation of Lakeview Estates HOA, their articles of incorporation. When Mac finally unearthed the original filings from the Dusty County archives, were a revelation. They were poorly drafted, their claimed common areas vaguely defined and, in several key instances, appearing to overlap significantly with parcels clearly and solely titled to me. The community park they boasted of in their brochures? My land. The charming little gravel path leading to their exclusive members-only beach access? My land. The imposing faux stone entrance pillars and the ostentatious Lakeview Estates a private community sign? All firmly planted several dozen feet inside my undisputed property line, constituting an ongoing trespass I had simply tolerated due to benign neglect until now. They weren't just operating outside their legal authority, they were squatting. Mac, with a certain theatrical flair, even managed to secure drone footage, perfectly legal, flown from public airspace, showing unusual activity late one night at the small, glorified shed they called the HOA clubhouse, also on my land it turned out. Figures, identifiable as Brenda and a couple of her remaining loyalists, were seen carrying boxes of files to a waiting vehicle. Spoliation of evidence. Lovely. I remained a figure of cold, unwavering calm to the outside world. Internally, however, the righteous fury was a constant, motivating burn. They had not merely stolen a boat and attempted extortion. They had presumed to defile a sanctuary, a place of peace and family legacy. The fight was intensely personal, but my strategy was ruthlessly impersonal, driven by legal statute and unassailable evidence. They thought they were poking a badger. I told my wife one evening, reviewing the latest batch of incriminating documents. They didn't realize the badger was also a bear, with a law degree and a deep-seated aversion to vermin. The preparation for summary judgment was akin to assembling an artillery barrage. Every piece of evidence, every admission, every contradictory statement from their depositions, which were a masterclass in prevarication and selective amnesia on their part, was another shell in the chamber, ready to be unleashed. The local corruption angle Mac had hinted at began to solidify. Emails discovered through third-party subpoenas revealed that Brenda Millstone had made several campaign contributions to a local county commissioner, Thomas Siska, who had conveniently overlooked complaints about Lakeview Estates' unpermitted constructions and questionable runoff into my lake for years. Commissioner Siska was about to have a very bad day when this information found its way to the State Ethics Commission and the press. This was no longer just about an HOA. It was about unraveling a knot of local rot. The motion for summary judgment was a ponderous document, thick with appended exhibits, deeds, surveys, bank records, affidavits from repentant former board members, transcripts of incriminating voicemails and damning excerpts from Brenda Millstone's own deposition where she contradicted herself no fewer than 17 times under oath. The core argument was brutally simple. There were no genuine issues of material fact in dispute regarding the primary torts. My ownership was absolute. Their trespass and conversion were undeniable. Their fine was baseless. Their internal corruption was rampant. The only matter left for a full trial, I argued, should be the precise calculation of compensatory and, more significantly, punitive damages. The hearing was blessedly brief. Judge Henderson, having waded through the evidentiary swamp I'd provided, was visibly unimpressed with Barry Fishbein's increasingly desperate attempts to muddy the waters. "Counselor," she addressed Fishbein, her voice flat, "your client's president admitted under oath that she authorized the removal of Mr. Clark's boat. She admitted the HOA levied an $800 fine, She admitted the HOA has no deeded right to Mr. Clark's lakefront property. Are these facts in dispute? Fishbein, pale and defeated, could only manage a weak, "No, Your Honor, but the motivations, the context." "The context, Mr. Fishbein," Judge Henderson interjected, "appears to be one of egregious overreach and shocking fiscal mismanagement, if not outright fraud. Motivation is largely irrelevant to the torts of conversion and trespass when the actions themselves are so clearly established." Partial summary judgment for the plaintiff, Mr. Plaintiff 2R conversion. Clark is granted on the counts of conversion, trespass to chattel, and trespass to land. The matter of damages, and the plaintiff's further claims regarding the dissolution of the HOA due to illegal operation and insolvency, will be addressed at a subsequent hearing. I am also, given the alarming evidence of financial irregularities presented, issuing an order appointing a temporary receiver to take control of all remaining HOA assets and records. Effective immediately, Brenda Millstone actually gasped. A receiver. The ultimate indignity. Her little kingdom was being dismantled piece by piece, right before her eyes. While the civil case proceeded, I assembled another, more sinister package. Every piece of evidence Mac and I had gathered relating to embezzlement, bank fraud, mail fraud, those threatening fine letters sent through the USPS, and potential tax evasion by Brenda Millstone and quite possibly other key players in her inner circle, was meticulously compiled, cross-referenced, and bound. This wasn't for Judge Henderson. This was for the District Attorney's Office and the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS. A cover letter, brief and professional, explained that as an officer of the court and a concerned citizen, I felt duty-bound to bring these matters to their attention. My civic duty, I had murmured to Mac, a glint of cold satisfaction in my eyes. Let the wheels of a different kind of justice begin to turn. True to form, the DA's office, presented with such a well-organized case already gift-wrapped, launched a formal investigation within weeks. IRS agents, notoriously tenacious, were not far behind, slapping liens on Brenda's personal assets, including her oversized faux Tuscan house in Lakeview Estates. The news began to ripple through the local community. HOA president under criminal investigation screamed a headline in the county paper which had been gleefully following the civil suit. Lakeview Estates finances, seized by court order. The public humiliation was as potent a weapon as any legal filing. The remaining HOA board members, those not already cutting deals, scrambled. Their legal fees were mounting, their personal assets exposed, and now the threat of criminal charges loomed. One by one, they capitulated, offering settlements, signing affidavits, implicating Brenda in everything from fixing board elections to siphoning funds for landscaping services that consisted of her nephew Cecil occasionally showing up with a leaf blower. Mac, bless his conspiratorial heart, had managed to find the ultimate smoking gun, a series of deleted emails from Brenda's personal account, recovered from a cloud backup she'd forgotten existed. In them, she explicitly detailed her plan to use the fine against me as leverage to resolve the HOA's unfortunate cash flow situation, and to finally make that uppity lake owner pay for his disrespect. The precision of the language, her clear intent, was damning. She wasn't just a bully, she was a premeditated financial predator. This was never just about a messy boat, was it? I mused, staring at the printouts. It was about power, money, and a monumental ego. And she picked the wrong target to finance her crumbling empire. The righteous fury had now cooled into something more akin to the grim resolve of an executioner. This wasn't vengeance, not entirely. It was restoration, the restoration of order, of boundaries, of the simple principle that actions have consequences. Brenda Millstone and her sham HOA were about to learn that lesson in the most permanent way possible. The battle over the boat was won, but the war for the territory was entering its final decisive phase. The receivership and the criminal investigations were dismantling the HOA from within, but I wanted its parasitic presence excised from my land permanently. My property lines, established and recorded long before Lakeview Estates was a twinkle in some developer's avaricious eye, were not mere suggestions, they were an assertion of sovereign right. The summary judgment had affirmed my ownership and their trespass. Now, it was time to enforce it. Brenda's folly, as I'd begun to call the entire debacle, extended beyond her financial crimes. The original surveyors for Lakeview Estates had either been incompetent or complicit, because a significant portion of what the HOA marketed as community amenities, their clubhouse, their main entrance signage, their meticulously manicured, with allegedly misappropriated funds, scenic overlook by the lake, were squarely, unequivocally on my property. The HOA's entire operational footprint, the very symbols of its supposed authority, were trespassing. Formal eviction notices were drawn up, addressed to the Lakeview Estates HOA, CO, the court-appointed receiver. They demanded the removal of all HOA structures, signage, landscaping, and personal property from the parcels identified as mine within 30 days. Failure to comply would result in me arranging for their removal and disposal, the costs of which would be added to the already substantial damages claim against the HOA's rapidly dwindling assets and its personally liable former board members. This was the full, devastating reveal. I wasn't just the litigious lawyer who owned the stolen boat. I was the invisible landlord upon whose domain their entire charade had been built. I owned the stage, the props, and the very ground beneath their feet. The remaining homeowners in Lakeview Estates, those not directly implicated in Brenda's schemes, were thrown into panic. Their HOA was insolvent, its leadership disgraced and facing prison time. Their property values, once artificially inflated by Brenda's iron-fisted control over aesthetic standards, were now plummeting. And their beloved community features were about to be bulldozed. I held a meeting, not with the defunct HOA board, but with the homeowners themselves, inviting them to the boat park pavilion, newly repaired, a subtle show of my own commitment to my property. I laid out the situation calmly, presenting the surveys, the deeds. I explained that the existing HOA was legally dead, a victim of its own corruption and illegality. Your former leadership, I stated, my voice devoid of triumph, built their empire on a foundation of lies and on land that was never theirs. That chapter is closed. Then, I offered them a path forward, a strategic masterstroke of appearing magnanimous while asserting absolute control. For those of you whose homes are legitimately on your own deeded lots, I announced, you are free to form a new legally compliant homeowners association, one that respects property lines, operates transparently, and abides by the law. I will even grant a formal revocable easement for access over my existing road for a nominal annual fee, provided your new association maintains it to an acceptable standard. For those few properties whose very lots might be found to have encroached due to the original shoddy surveying, individual negotiations would be required, leases, boundary adjustments, or, regrettably, relocation. The effect was immediate. Relief, mixed with a dawning understanding of how thoroughly they'd been duped by Brenda. I wasn't the enemy. I was the one offering a lifeline out of the mess she had created. This effectively isolated Brenda and her cronies completely, transforming the bulk of Lakeview residents from potentially hostile neighbors into reluctantly grateful ones. Brenda Millstone was arrested a week later, led from her McMansion in handcuffs. The charges included multiple counts of embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The image of her, stripped of her power suits and haughty demeanor, looking bewildered and defeated, graced the front page of the local paper. There was no joy in it for me, only a grim acknowledgement of a necessary outcome. She built her castle on my sand, I remarked to Mac. And the tide, as it always does, came in. The symbolic act of dismantling came a few weeks later. Under the watchful eye of the receiver and a handful of curious Lakeview residents, a contracted crew, hired by me but paid from the frozen HOA funds, began removing the oversized Lakeview Estates, a private community sign. The faux stone pillars crumbled easily. It wasn't just a sign coming down, it was the fall of a petty tyranny. The air itself felt lighter. This was never just about the fine or the boat. It was about the fundamental truth that some people believe rules are for others. Brenda Millstone learned, too late, that those rules, especially when tied to the unyielding reality of property deeds and the full force of the law, are absolute. She crossed a line into my world, and in doing so, invited my world to dismantle hers. The final court hearing was less a battle and more a post-mortem. Judge Henderson, armed with the receiver's devastating report on the HOA's finances, or lack thereof, and the unassailable evidence of their malfeasance, was in no mood for further theatrics from the remnants of the defense. Barry Fishbein, now representing only the skeletal, bankrupt shell of the HOA entity itself, most individual board members having already settled or declared bankruptcy, could only offer token resistance. I presented my itemized claim for damages. The cost of repairing the Amelia's Lark, professionally assessed at several $1,000s due to the deep gouges and the oil stain on the irreplaceable teak. The loss of use, calculated at a reasonable daily charter rate for a comparable vessel for the period it was unlawfully detained. My legal costs, meticulously logged, even though I was pro se. I argued for their inclusion as a measure of the resources diverted to combating this frivolous and malicious persecution. But the centerpiece was the punitive damages. Your Honor, I stated, my voice resonating with cold clarity. This was not a mistake. This was a calculated act of intimidation and attempted extortion, part of a larger pattern of abuse and financial impropriety by the defendants. The initial $800 fine was not arbitrary. It was a demand intended to cripple, to cow, to fund their ongoing illicit activities. A message must be sent, not just to these defendants, but to any who might contemplate such predatory behavior, that the law will not tolerate such arrogance, such contempt for the rights of others. I didn't ask for the full $8 million that a tenfold multiplier might imply. Instead, I proposed a figure that was both devastatingly punitive to the defendants and symbolically resonant, $800, the exact sum they had attempted to extort from me. Let that be the price of their hubris. Judge Henderson listened impassively, her gaze sweeping over Brenda Millstone, who was present in prison attire, her criminal trial still pending but her guilt in this civil matter already a foregone conclusion. The other former board members who hadn't settled looked ashen. The court finds. Judge Henderson announced after a brief recess that the actions of the Lakeview Estates HOA, under the leadership of Miss Millstone and with the complicity of its board, were malicious, willful, and undertaken in bad faith. The evidence of conversion, trespass, and attempted extortion is overwhelming. Furthermore, the evidence of gross financial mismanagement and breach of fiduciary duty is deeply disturbing. She awarded the full compensatory damages for the boat repairs and loss of use. She awarded a significant portion of my claimed legal costs. And then, the hammer. Regarding punitive damages, she continued, her eyes fixing on Brenda. The court concurs with Mr. Clark. The audacity of the defendant's initial demand must be met with a proportionate penalty. Punitive damages are hereby awarded to the plaintiff in the sum of $800 to be levied against the assets of the Lakeview Estates HOA and jointly and severally against Ms. Brenda Millstone and those board members found culpable who have not otherwise reached a settlement with the plaintiff. A collective gasp went through the defendant's side of the room. The HOA was already bankrupt. The receiver would allocate any pennies left. This meant the burden would fall squarely on Brenda and her cohort's personal assets, those not already seized by the IRS or protected by bankruptcy, which would be hard to claim given the findings of fraud. The original fine they had conjured from thin air had become their albatross, dragging them into a financial abyss. The judge further affirmed the legal dissolution of the Lakeview Estates Homeowners Association as a corporate entity, citing its insolvency, its history of operating ultra-vires, and its demonstrated incapacity to function within the bounds of the law. All remaining assets were to be liquidated by the receiver to satisfy creditor claims, with my judgment taking precedence. There was no elation in that moment. I reflected later, only a profound sense of grim satisfaction, like closing a long, complex, and utterly distasteful case file. Justice, in its ponderous way, had arrived. The protective loyalty I felt for my property, for my family's peace, had been vindicated. My somber resilience had outlasted their bluster. The small group of now former Lakeview Estates residents who had supported me approached me afterwards, their relief palpable. Arthur Jenkins shook my hand. "You did what none of us could, Mr. Clark. You freed us." I simply nodded. Their gratitude was noted, but this was never about them. It was about a line drawn in the sand, a line Brenda Millstone had arrogantly crossed. The expensive new fence that now clearly demarcated my property from the truncated Lakeview development stood as a stark, physical testament to that line. A boundary, yes, but also an act of enduring defiance. The fight had taken its toll, shattering the illusion of inviolable peace, but it had also forged a harder, more vigilant resolve. The aftermath was a slow return to a new kind of normalcy. The dismantling of the old HOA's physical encroachments took weeks. The offending sign, the clubhouse, which turned out to be mostly rotted timber and hubris, the ill-conceived scenic overlook, all removed. The land beneath was regraded, seeded with native grasses, allowed to return to its natural state. My property breathed again. Clearwater Lake, once subject to the gaze of Brenda Millstone's judgmental surveillance, felt genuinely private once more. I spent several weekends personally supervising the restoration of the Amelia's lark, the scent of teak oil and marine varnish replacing the memory of Earl Perkins' grimy hands and the acrid smell of the impound lot. It was a cathartic act, reclaiming not just an object, but a piece of my own history, a symbol of freedom they had tried to chain. The new Lakeview Community Association, formed by the chastened homeowners, was a model of humility and legal compliance. Their representatives approached me, hat in hand, to formally request the easement I had offered. We negotiated a fair, modest agreement. They understood boundaries now. They understood consequences. The compensation, when it finally trickled in from liquidated assets and garnished accounts, was substantial. It wasn't a windfall I desired. A significant portion went into a newly established Clearwater Lake Preservation Trust, dedicated to maintaining the ecological health and natural beauty of the entire watershed for generations to come, a fitting irony. Turning funds born of greed and corruption into a force for enduring good. Some also quietly went to assist a few of the elderly Lakeview residents who had been genuinely harmed by Brenda's financial mismanagement, those who had lost savings to her special assessments for phantom projects. My porch light, switched on each evening, no longer felt like a beacon in a contested territory, but a simple welcome home. The view across the darkened water to the far shore, where the Amelia's lark bobbed gently at her mooring, was one of profound, hard-won peace. The locked gate at the main access road to my private domain, once casually bypassed by Brenda's tow trucks, was now a symbol of absolute control, a psychological closure on the entire sordid affair. There were still echoes, of course. The occasional news report on Brenda Millstone's ongoing criminal proceedings, the lingering sense of violation that slowly faded with each passing season. But the predominant feeling was one of quiet vigilance. I had never sought conflict. My life was dedicated to the intricate dance of federal law, a world far removed from petty neighborhood squabbles. I had purchased this land as a sanctuary, a legacy for my family, a place where the complexities of my professional life could recede. They brought their small, ugly war to my doorstep, driven by arrogance and a delusional sense of entitlement. They did not understand the nature of the man they provoked. They did not understand that my reluctance to engage was not weakness, but a preference for peace that, once irrevocably shattered, would be replaced by a capacity for meticulously planned, legally lethal, and morally unflinching retaliation. They had drawn first blood, figuratively speaking, with their trespass and theft. I had merely ensured that the bleeding stopped, decisively and permanently, on their side of the ledger. The moral cost of inaction, of allowing such an egregious wrong to stand, would have been far greater. The erosion of personal liberty, the tacit approval of tyranny, however small its scale. This was not just about an 800-0 fine or a dirty boat. It was about the fundamental principle that one's home, one's property, one's peace are not to be trifled with. They learned that some lines, once crossed, unleash forces they cannot comprehend. They learned that some individuals, when their sanctuary is threatened, possess a very particular set of skills acquired over a lifetime spent in the precise, relentless, and unyielding application of the law, and they learned, to their everlasting regret, that I was one of those individuals. The lake remained calm, reflecting the starlight, indifferent to the human dramas played out on its shores. But for me, its tranquility was now imbued with the hard edge of a lesson delivered, a peace not just inherited, but fiercely defended and unequivocally reclaimed.